Sorry about that. Now, this looks good. Okay, if you could tell me your name, sir, and which position that you held at Avtex, and what years you were there.
Well, my name is Jim Colbert, and I came to Front Royal to the American Viscose Corporation on the 27th of April of 1945. The plant was still making critical materials at that time, and I spent 38 and a half years all in the spinning department. The spinning department, box spinning is the oldest type of spinning, was the first form used, where the yarn is spun into a spinning box and thrown out around the sides by centrifugal force. The specifications for our spinning was called a lacing notice, and it told everything that we needed to know about what product we were going to make. The type of viscose we were going to use, the spin bath that was involved, the speed of the machine, all of these things were determined by the lacing notice. The viscose came in through pipelines to the box shop, came into a header on the machine, and each end or spinneret had an individual pump with a predetermined speed. The size and whole number of holes in the jet or spinneret was also determined, which told what line or product line we were going to make. The speeds were controlled from the powerhouse of the box spinning speed, and the machine was geared to speed so that they ran at the same speed all the time. The viscose solution, of course, was a caustic, syrupy-like material, and it was exposed to a spin bath, which was made up of sulfuric acid and sodium sulfate and zinc sulfate. The acid neutralized the soda, and as the viscose was extruded through the jet, it became a filament of rayon. This was the cellulose that was produced from the wood pulp that was the foundation of the viscose. We had quite a labor-intensive operation. We had a man who laced the machine, which was a case of physically putting the yarn around a wheel. It was then stretched through a hot solution of cascade water, which cascaded down from the top of the machine to the bottom, and the yarn was stretched. The wheels at the top were running faster than the ones at the bottom, so the stretch was put in the product at that point. It came off of that wheel and into a funnel and down into the spinning box, which was running at 7,000 revolutions a minute, and the yarn was thrown out against the side of the box, much like cotton candy is thrown out, and it formed a cake. That cake was also determined, the size of the cake was determined from the spinning lacing notice, and it ran into the box for a period of time, depending on how large the cake had to be. So that, for instance, in 2 hours from the time the yarn was laced into that spinning box, it was laced out of it, and it sat for a period for it to degas, and then it was doffed. A person came along and removed that cake of yarn and put it on a tray, and it was removed to the cake cabinet. The cake cabinet was conditioned with high humidity and some heat so that the yarn could not dry out until the acid that was left in it was washed out. If the acid were allowed to remain in it and dry, the acid crystallized and would cut the tiny filaments of yarn. So this was why it was such a labor-intensive process. It stayed in the cake cabinet for a period of time to degas and was kept moist with the high humidity. It then went to the cake wash, where it was washed free of acid, and a soft finish was applied to it for a sizing, and it was dried or whiz dried and then put into a dryer so it could be completely dried. It then went to the coning department, where it was taken from the cakes and put onto cones, and then to slashing, where it was put from cones to beams, which is the way most of it went out of the plant. We did not make a finished product. It was only cored, and it was there were used various adaptations after it got out of the plant. At most of the time that I was in spinning, we made tire cord in the box shop. I stayed in the box shop, and it operated until September of 1980, when it was shut down and to run no more. And then at some later date, the machines were removed. At one time, the box shop had 150 machines. All of them did run at one time. As production was curtailed somewhat, 50 of the machines that the government had put in during the war to increase production were taken out and sold to another plant and removed. So we wound up with 99 machines in the box shop in later years. And as production was curtailed, we got down as low as 65 that we were spinning at the time the plants shut down.
Did each of these machines require a number of people?
Yes. Yes. In the later years, the one man operated 3 machines. Someone else doffed the yarn out, and there were other attendants that did other things in the operation, but the one person was considered the lacer. He's the one who changed from one spinning box to another on a regular schedule so that the cakes were all of uniform size. They had each machine had a certain number of ends. In the beginning, there were 54 end machines. They had been altered to be 72 end machines, and in later years we cut them back when production was down to 36 end machines. All of these things were determined by the lacing notice, so that you knew exactly what you needed to do in order to make a certain product.
I'd like to clarify in my own mind exactly what went into the recipe or the mix for the viscose. I'm not quite clear as to what the cakes looked like, or what the material or product, the nature of the material or the product from the different stages.
Well, you need someone from the viscose department to go through the whole process. Of course, the pulp, when it came in from their supplier, looked very much like a white blotter. It was a porous material. It came in bales, about 500-pound bales. It was steeped in caustic soda. The pulp was ground up into crumbs. CS2 was added. There was a process called xanthating, where the viscose became a solution from pulp to a solution, which looked very much like Karo syrup. It was an orange-like viscose material, and it was syrupy like syrup. It had caustic base, and that's what happened in the spinning process. The spin bath neutralized the soda and left the cellulose, which is what rayon is. Each jet or spinneret had a number of holes, which also was specified by the lacing notice. You may have, we had 490 hole jets, we had 980 hole jets, we had 1,500 hole jets, and these spun different types of yarn, different deniers, and different number of filaments. And each tiny hole, which was so tiny that you could barely see light through it, smaller than a hair, formed a strand of rayon. And in this cake, depending on the number of holes in the jet, was the number of strands of rayon that was in that cake that spun around in the box. If you had a 490 hole jet, you had 490 filaments in each strand of rayon. If it was 980, there was 980 whole strands. And the denier was determined by the pulp speed, which told you how much viscose was being delivered, and that determined the denier of the yarn that you were spinning.
The thickness, the denier.
The denier, right.
What are some of the products that were created from this fiber?
Well, as I said, mainly the yarns that we made in the box shop were into tire cord. The reason that I feel that the box shop lasted as long as it did, it had a quality that the other yarns did not have. It had a twist in it when it was made. The spinning speed and the spinning box speed determined the amount of twist per inch that was in the yarn when it left the box shop. And this was something that had to be done to other yarns in another process. The other spinning product that we had were in continuous spinning, is what you here referred to as the double deck. Now the whole process was done in double deck. The yarn was spun, it was stretched, washed, and dried. You had instead of wheels, they had drums, and you put, so your lacing notice told how many wraps you put on a drum to give it sufficient washing. The acid was washed out right on the machine, and then it dropped down to the lower floor and was wound around a steam-filled drum that dried it, and it was put onto a tube or cone at that point, but it was flat yarn. It had no twist in it. There was no, they never found out a way to put twist in it in that operation. So that the yarn, after it left the double deck, had to be twisted. So this was a separate operation where you took the cones or tubes and put them onto a beam, and in the process it was twisted. So that was another condition that was necessary to satisfy our customers. And double deck yarn was used for a number of other things other than tire cord. It was used in carpeting, and it was also dipped, had an adhesive dip that was put on, and still another process, and it was used for hose reinforcement, like garden hose or hydraulic hose, brake hose, things of that sort.
Do you know who some of the businesses were that purchased this product?
Well, we sold yarn to most all of the tire companies at one time or another. Firestone was one of our big customers. Goodrich and Goodyear also, back in those years, were our customers from time to time.
Now I know that Avtex has a patented process that was used. Mr. Ledman spoke of this. Was your production area involved in any of the new technology that came out of the factory?
Well, there was always something going on with the technical department to improve the yarns that we made. We had pilot plant machines which were set up to try different speeds, different stretches, different viscose makeup to improve the strength, the durability, various other qualities that were conducive to the sale of our yarn. So we were constantly doing those things. We'd try them on a pilot machine and see if we could get the best possible results, and then it would be change the lacing notice and start a production line with that. So there was constant work to try to improve those things.
What was life like at Avtex? Looking at the news magazines and the letters that came out of there, it appeared to be more of a community than most other businesses.
There was some of that, and of course Viscose got a bad name for a workplace, primarily, in my opinion, because it was a continuous operation, and you had to have somebody there around the clock, and Saturdays, Sundays, nights, and all. And this was a thing that sort of went against the grain with young people who would rather be out partying on Saturday nights than working. So they said it was a bad place to work, and it really wasn't true. It wasn't that bad a place to work. Most anybody who worked there for 25 or 30 years will tell you that it was not a bad place to work.
No.
There was, of course, in the spinning department, there were some fumes. However, the lab kept a check on fume levels so that they were kept under control, or what was acceptable at that time for working conditions. And as I said, the fact that you had to work nights and weekends was the thing that a lot of people didn't like about the place. But there was a lot of great friendships established there. Of course, a lot of people bought their homes here and educated their children from working at the plant. So the plant also had a lot of people who came to the governments of the town and county and served on the school board and things of that sort, mayor of the town. And so it was a place that not only worked here but contributed to the lifestyle of the community. Put a lot of money into the community and improved the living standards of this town greatly, and also surrounding areas. We had people who came as far as 50 miles from here and commuted to work. And there was an irony about that. We had a man who lived in Shenandoah, which is about 50 miles from here, and when we had the 40-inch snow back in the 60s, he came to work. Some of the ones who lived in town didn't make it.
Now, were you assigned a shift, or did a rotating shift occur?
You were assigned a shift, but we had a rotating schedule. For our regular shift work, we had 4 shifts that worked around the clock. The 7 to 3:30 shift worked 7 days. They started on Wednesday at 7 o'clock and finished up on Tuesday at 3:30. The shift that worked 3:30 to 12 started at 3:30 on Friday and worked until midnight of the next Thursday. The 12 to 7 shift started on Monday night at 12 o'clock and worked till the following Monday morning at 7. So that one shift was on break all of the time and the other 3 shifts were working. As a shift broke, another one took over, and you had each day of the week off during the 28-day cycle that your shifts worked. You worked 7 days of each shift, and you were off 7 days. And that was the rotating schedule that we worked on production. They had a number of schedules that they worked in different departments for different conditions. But for the continuous operation, where you had to have someone there all the time, that was the schedule that we used. It was called a 4 rotating shift.
So if you were on the evenings, did you remain on evenings throughout all of the course of your work, or did you work evenings one week and then come back on days after your break?
You worked days, then 3:30 to 12, and then 12 to 7.
Okay.
The night shift was only 7 hours long, but you worked 6 days of that in a week. The others you only worked 5 days. Your average 42 hours a week. Two of the pay periods were 42 and a half hours. One was 41, and the other one was 42 even.
How did you thrive under that changing schedule? Was that
Some did, some didn't. Some people couldn't adjust to the night shift. They couldn't sleep during the day, but it was something that you got used to. And I worked it for 20-some years. I didn't have a trouble. I could go to sleep anytime, so I didn't have a problem with sleeping during the day. So.
How many people worked at the plant altogether? I know the numbers varied as the years went.
Well, it varied very drastically because of at one time in the mid-40s we had a coal shortage and shut the plant down. It was shut down for about 6 weeks. We kept the lines open by what we call flushing. They made a small amount of viscose and moved it through the lines each shift, so it kept it open, and when time came to start it back up, all we had to do was start making viscose and start the plant back up. So we had layoffs at that time, and the number of people was just a skeleton crew that was there at that time. But at the time that I went there, it was around nearly 4,000 people, between 3,800 and 4,000 people. There have been a number of people work there. Each of the plants were given a series of numbers. Each person who worked at the plant had what they call a permanent number. My number was 65696. The numbers started at 60,000 for the plant. And they went through those 10,000 numbers and started using them over again. So I'll give you an idea about how many people have worked there in the course of the nearly 50 years that it operated. We had people who came here from other plants. When the plant started, they gave people the option to come here and start this plant. Ones who had some experience. They didn't necessarily know exactly the way this plant was going to run, but they had an idea of the process. This plant, of course, at the time it was built, was the newest and most modern of the plants that the corporation had. So these things were somewhat different. But we had some people, I believe, from practically all the plants. I know we had people from Parkersburg, Roanoke, Lewistown, Meadville. No, I'm not sure about Meadville. We did from Lewistown and Marcus Hook. Those were the plants that were in existence before. I don't know that anybody came here from Meadville because it was a different type of operation. They did not use the viscose process at Meadville, as far as I know.
Now, I know you said during the 6-week coal shortage you had to run a small amount of viscose through the equipment so that it would be ready to produce again. When the plant closed down, did all of those machines end up being ruined?
When viscose stops flowing, it solidifies and it becomes a rubbery substance and cannot be pushed through by pumps as it is normally. The lines have to be taken down and forced out, rotted out, or cleaned out in some way. So you have to keep the viscose running in order to start back up again. We had times during the operation of the plant where you shut down for repairs. Years back, we used to shut down at least 3 or 4 times a year. They stopped doing it in the wintertime because of water pipes freezing and things of that sort while we were shut down and had trouble getting started back up. But this was a continuous operation, and when we had a shutdown, it took probably at different times, different stages, 10 or 11 days from the time you stopped making viscose until the product stopped coming out at the other end. So it was not a thing where you could just stop and start. It was a very complex operation where you had to keep things moving or you didn't go.
I know that you said you weren't there at the time that the plant closed.
No.
Did, through your friends who were there, could you speak just a little bit about the effect that had on the community, on the plant itself? Could you talk a little bit about the closing, how it happened, and what your thoughts and feelings are about it?
Well, I felt that the closing was not done in the proper fashion. Had it been done in an orderly fashion, the materials that went into the viscose could have been scheduled so that they ran out or were spun out rather than being hauled back to the supplier or wasted as they were. Of course, whatever viscose was in the line was a complete waste, and it could have been spun on through the process had they taken, as I said, 10, 11, 12 days to shut it down. They could have shut the thing down and had the pipes empty at the time, and none of this cleaning and a lot of the cleanup could have been avoided. For instance, the CS2, they could have used up what was there and made it into viscose, and there would have been no viscose or no CS2 cleanup. This is true of all of the chemicals that were involved. They could have been scheduled. You couldn't have figured it out right to the gallon or the pound, but been a lot better than it is or was.
As we've been talking about the product and life at the plant and the closing, have you thought of any other aspects of Avtex and your life and work there that you feel should come to light here, that you feel has been left out? Is there anything that you would like to add at this point?
Well, people who never worked there had no idea what went on in the plant. It was a complex thing, and as I mentioned about the working on Saturday nights and Sundays and things was least desirable for the people who worked. It required a lot of people and a lot of training. The job of lacing a box spinning machine was quite different from anything you've ever done. In one thing, most people are right-handed, and you had to lace with your left hand. You could not lace right-handed. There was no way you could do it. I've seen people try it, but you just absolutely couldn't lace right-handed. You had to do it left-handed, and it was difficult. It took a certain amount of hand and eye coordination, and it was a very difficult thing to learn. A lot of people gave up on it and never learned. Just was too frustrating. They wouldn't try. But once you got the hang of it, it was a very simple job. It was almost artistic. Some people got so good at it that they could almost do it with their eyes shut.
Did they have a lunchroom there?
Yes.
And they had a nurse too, didn't they?
Yes, had a dispensary, and in the early years had a doctor, and had nurses around the clock and doctors. They did physicals and did routine physicals on the people. They used to give flu shots at the plant for their employees. They had an investigator who, if you didn't go to work for a few days, would come out and check on you to see why you weren't there. He was kept quite busy with some of the people that farmed on the side. He'd find them plowing instead of coming to work, but he did these investigations. But it was quite an operation. The nurses were around the clock, and they did routine physicals. They really had the people's health and conditions at heart, and tried to keep the people healthy and in working condition.
That seems unusual. Was it because you were working with hazardous materials?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that was it at all.
No.
It was just a matter of the well-being of the people there.
Did you notice many of the employees having health problems, or did it seem to be a healthy enough environment that it didn't affect people?
We had people who worked there in those conditions for 35, 40 years, and apparently had no ill effects from it.
Do you feel that the plant has affected the health of people here in Front Royal?
No, I don't. And there was an odor here, and most people who lived here got used to it. The only time they really noticed it, and people traveling through, is when they came into this area and smelled it. Or if you were out of town for a period of time and came back, you smelled it. But when you were here, you got used to it. People used to say that was their bread and butter. It didn't smell bad.
I keep feeling like we've left something important out, because I'm not really sure of some of the questions that I should ask you. Do you want to talk any more about the effect of Avtex on the community, or the closing of Avtex on the community?
Well, Avtex had started to fade away some before it closed down. I don't know, but the exact number, but there probably were down to 500 or 600 people by the time it shut down. The plant had phased out a lot of operations. The box shop, which was one of the things that took most of the people, closed down in 1980. And that affected all of these other departments at that time. When you shut down the box shop, the cake wash shut down, the coning and slashing shut down. Of course, it affected shipping and all as well. And the people in the technical department who were associated with that, there were a lot of air analysis run. There was a lot of testing of viscose. There was testing of acid. These things were kept under control, so that you kept an even keel, so that if things got out of whack chemically, then the yarn wouldn't spin. So you had in the spinning departments, you had glass funnels and glass wheels, or Pyrex wheels, and of course anytime you have glass, you have breakage and nicks and things, and if you got acid into a cut, it made an acid sore, and you had to get the acid out of it or it would become infected. That was one of the worst health problems in the spinning department. As far, we did have some people who had weak eyes, who had fume eyes. Their eyes would get inflamed and irritated, and usually they would have to leave the department. It was evidently a deficiency of some sort, because everybody didn't get it, and all worked in the same conditions, but some people's eyes just wouldn't stand it.
The whole plant, now that you've spent a large portion of your life at Avtex, just as an outsider looking in and looking back at the times, it seems amazing to me that they had doctors and nurses around the clock, and the way they conducted their training, the innovations at the plant. It just seems like this phenomenal city almost.
Right. And of course the town, when I don't know the population, but it was probably 2,500 or so when the plant came here. It was kind of a country town until the plant came.
So the plant changed the face of Front Royal forever.
And the surrounding area.
How do you feel about the cleanup and the remediation? What are your hopes and wishes for the future of the site?
Well, I'd like to see something come of it, and I think it's taken too long. And I think had it been shut down in an orderly fashion, they would have speeded up that operation, that part of the operation.
Before I turn off the camera, do you want to add anything at all?
Well, I'd say it was a great place to work. It did have some smell to it, but they were great people to work for, and some of the finest people in Front Royal came here to work at the plant. I can tell you that. Some of them are still here. A lot of them are long gone, but there's still some great people here that came to work at the plant.
Yeah, it seems like I hate to turn off the camera.
In the box shop, and I just found that information out that in November of 1962, 4 black people were assigned to the box shop, 1 to each shift, as a pilot to see how the integration of production would go, and those were the first black people in production. Up until that time, they had been in a service department, did janitorial work and that sort of thing. We had no problems. I was able to get that information from Dave Ramsey at the Union Hall. I gave him the names of the people, and he found 3 of them in the records where they came to work on the 17th of November of 1962, and we had no problems. And from then on, it spread into the other departments, and finally into engineering, so that the whole plant was integrated in a matter of a short time.
Avtex just seems to me to be unique, doing things different than maybe even the torpedo factory that you worked at before. They just seem to be a cut above most other plants.
Well, of course, the torpedo station was a government operation, so that made a difference there. And of course, the government had a big influence on Avtex. When I came here, they were operating on a cost-plus basis to make all of the yarn possible, and that was an incentive to get as much production out as you could possibly make. They made all the viscose that they could make, regardless of whether or not we could spin it.
Now, were the people who worked there, were they aware of some of the uses that the government was making with this product?
Oh yes, I think so. I think so. I'm sure there were, and of course the plant, with its technical department, worked with a lot of the companies that were their customers in developing these things. Since we made no product that was a saleable product as such, all of these things took the work of the company that we sold to, along with our technical people, to develop these products.
I know this is a funny question, and most of your product went to tires. But when you see rayon clothing, was any of the Avtex fibers used to produce clothing as well?
Oh yes, but we made very little of that here. Most of that was made in the other plants, and it was fine denier. We did have a run of fine denier at one time here, with a few machines, but it was a very small operation. Most of the yarn in the other plants was fine denier. The Lewistown plant was primarily all fine denier.
Who owned Avtex at the time that you worked? I know FMC is the only company left that did not go bankrupt. Did the government shutdowns cause these companies to go out of business? I don't know if you...
I really couldn't speak to that.
Okay.
Yeah, when I came here, it was American Viscose Corporation. Then in 1962 or 3, whenever FMC bought it and made it the fibers division of FMC. FMC was a food machinery corporation. They made machinery that picked fruit and vegetables and bean hullers and shakers to shake nuts off of trees and all kinds of things like that. They also, of course, bought FMC. They also bought Peerless Pulp, and they bought Link Belt that made the cranes. So they were quite a big, diversified company, and they really weren't rayon people. So that's probably why they didn't keep it any longer than they did. And they were probably lucky that John Gregg took it off their hands and gave people work for another 13 years, really, from the time he took it over. So it would probably have died on the vine when FMC decided to give it up, had it not been for John Gregg taking it over. One of the things that came out in cost reduction and trying to cut down on labor is that you had a group of girls, ladies, who wrapped all of the cakes. They were stored in the cabinet just as they were taken from the machine, and they had a sleeve like that was put over the cake inside and out to protect it while it was washed and handled. In later years, they changed that and put it so that when the cake was doffed from the machine, it was wrapped then and went to the cake cabinet wrapped rather than going to that department. And at that time, they did away with the wrap department. So this eliminated people, and there were always things like that going on. At one time, they had a whole room full of industrial engineers or time study people who went around to the departments to do time studies and determine whether things were being done the best and most economical way time-wise, so that you do a time study and you'd cut down on the amount of time that it took to do a certain thing, or you may change the way it was done so that it would be more efficient operation.
It sounds like
the date is March 15th, 2001. We're interviewing Jim Coor, and this is part of the Avtex oral history interviews.
5, 4, 3, 2. Jim, tell us a little bit about how you first came to Avtex and when.
Well, I was with the Avtex and successive companies for 35 years. And I went to work at the Nitro, West Virginia plant in May of 1946, after World War II, getting out of World War II. and retired from Front Royal the 1st of April in 1982. I spent 10 years at Nitro, West Virginia, and I came to Front Royal in 1955 and spent 10 years in Front Royal. And then I spent about 12 years at other plants, Nitro, Lewistown, Meadville, primarily. Came back to Front Royal in 1977 and retired from Front Royal in 1982.
And what was your job?
Well, I've been involved in primarily in technical and manufacturing at the plant level. Most what they used to call the acid department, where work around the fumes and so forth, and with all the activity now on CS2 and H2S, carbon disulfide. Probably shouldn't be alive, but anyway, didn't seem to affect me particularly. Spent most of my life in those areas.
Was there a different attitude then towards working in those kind of chemicals than there is now?
Well, I wasn't aware of any attitude, adverse attitude, even when I retired in '82. But it's gotten to be quite a factor now on pollution, primarily from CS2, which is carbon disulfide, hydrogen sulfide. But most of the people that talk about it are not very well posted. Lots been said over at this plant about PCBs and whatnot. We didn't make those. They just came from the transformers that were around. And they scattered all over Warren County. At one time, any transformer that was any good had PCB in it. It was the best oil that they used for transformers, and still a lot around. So I never had any direct contact with PCBs other than what anybody else would have had. I didn't work on transformers.
The transformers were in the power plant?
Well, there were some on the roof. They were scattered pretty well around the plant. And the ones that caused the most trouble, I think, was one on the roof here at Front Royal, shortly before the plant shut down. I don't know, it had a fire or something, but anyway, it ruptured and PCBs got on the roof and then in the drainage system, and then some of which wound up in the road. I wasn't familiar with that. I don't think I was here at the time.
Could you explain exactly what your job was, what you did when you were working at the plant here in Front Royal?
Well, when I was here the first time, I had charge of the technical, what was called at that time the technical department. I had all the chemists in the plant working for me, and various technicians who did all the testing, set all the technical specifications for the process, the product, monitored it, and for 5 years, and then after that I was in what they called the manufacturing superintendent at that time, had charge of all the manufacturing plants departments. I did not have charge of the engineering. I had charge of the, wherever the product process was. At different other times, I was plant manager at Nitro for West Virginia for a couple of years, plant manager of Lewistown, Pennsylvania plant for a couple of years. At that time I had charge of the whole plant. When I was at Lewistown, that was the largest plant that we had at that time in terms of people. We had about 3,000 plus people working directly for the company. And they were always engineers and contractors and whatnot hired in addition to that. It was a very big operation, but it's quite an old plant. And it was finally shut down. I believe it was after Hazel, one of the floods came by and the company made the decision to shut it down. I also was at Lewistown on scrapping the plant, took care of supervising the contract personnel that tore the plant down, reclaimed the scrap metal and sold it, and so forth. So I had some experience in that area, but things change and EPA has gotten much more active than they were at that time. But I'm fairly familiar with drain lines and all kinds of stuff like that, tanks, cutting them up and so forth. My last job at Front Royal, I had charge of the acid reclaim, zinc recovery, and waste treatment operations.
What was the acid reclaim and zinc recovery all about?
Well, the acid, so-called acid reclaim, took care of the acid, rayon is spun in acid baths, and we control all the acid baths in the plant, and water is generated in the process, so we had to remove water with evaporators, and also removed a byproduct, sodium sulfate, and sold that. And it was quite a big sales product. It was really a byproduct of the rayon manufacturing. The zinc recovery was primarily taking zinc oxide from the basins where it had been pumped over the years and processing it so we could use it back in the acid baths, which contained, among other things, zinc. It would have been zinc sulfate in the acid baths. And that's more or less where I spent my time with the company.
How many people were working at the plant when you first came?
When I was at Front Royal the first time, it was somewhere around 2,500 employees working for the company, not counting the contract personnel. In good times it would go up 200 or 300. Bad times it would go down 200 or 300. So there was turnover in primarily the younger people that were hired. When you go up, you'd have people cut back, they get laid off, The union had various seniority arrangements and agreements that specified who would get laid off first. And a lot of the union activities at that time had to do with seniority, because everybody wanted to have as much as they could so that they wouldn't get laid off. We used to have a lot of people, particularly Front Royal, who would use the seniority more or less in reverse. They'd take off in the summertime with the understanding they could come back, particularly women, and stay home with the kids in the summer and then come back in the winter. I doubt if they'd let you do that now.
Was the plant busier in the winter than it was in the summer?
No, they just, the ups and downs didn't really follow any particular season. It just followed the economic climate of the country as a whole. Sometimes you were in a period where you could sell all the rayon you could make, plus some, and other times you couldn't sell it. You couldn't sell all that we made.
Was that fashion, driven by fashion, or the economy?
I don't think it was driven by as much by fashion as it was by the economy. At that time, rayon went, different plants made different types of rayon, but at Front Royal, most of it was going into tire yarn or related products, and the staple mostly was going into apparel and clothing, and some at one time were real big on carpets, such as on the floor here. Also, it would the apparel industry would change a little bit from time to time, but it didn't really have too much to do with fashions per se as it did from other factors. And of course, the same thing would happen on the mills that we were selling to. At times they'd go through the same cycle. They went down. They didn't usually shut down, but they'd cut way back. We do the same thing. We also exported quite a lot over a period of years, particularly in the apparel industry.
Were there a lot of women working at the plant? And was that sort of a leftover factor from World War II?
Well, there were a few that were left over from World War II, but they pretty much drifted into what at that time was considered women's jobs. And for many years, they had jobs which they classified as men's jobs, jobs that they classified as women's jobs. And all of the twisting and coning and warping operations, handling the rayon after it was already made, but putting it in some form where it could be sold was done by women. And
was that unusual at the time? Was this plant unusual in there?
No, that was just the customary part of it at that time. One time, back when I was going to school, I worked the summer in a cotton mill, huge cotton mill really at that time, down in Georgia, and they were the same way. All certain operations were women, all of other operations were men. So that was the way, more or less the way society was structured at that time.
I've been told that the plant was important for the people who worked there, not just because it was a source of income, but that it was also, their whole lives kind of revolved around the plant. Their social life, their medical care, Is that true?
Well, the medical care then was different than it is now. Every plant at one time had, we had about 7 or 8 plants. Every one at one time had a full-time doctor at the plant, and also had a, you should call it a registered nurse around the clock. There was always a registered nurse on. Had their own dispensary, which had a few beds in it. You get sick, they'd let you lay down in the bed. If they thought you bad shapes, call an ambulance and send you to the hospital. And they also ran their own x-rays and EKGs and various other tests, a common thing. And that's pretty much a thing of the past now. But they took care of everything. I had 3 children, and they paid for all of that. I remember on one of them it cost me 50 cents. And somehow or another they put a bracelet on, and they didn't allow that in the pass over charges on the baby. So I had to pay 50 cents. But the company by and large took care of all of your medical expenses, which is good or bad depending on how you look at it. Some people abused it, others didn't. Some in the medical profession abused it too, and others didn't. There was a kind of a bond between departments, people that worked together. You know, a lot of people worked hard in the plant and sent the kids through school, to college, and advanced degrees, a few of them, that type of a thing. Had a lot of second generation people working in Front Royal, where their parents, one or both of their parents had worked here, and then they worked here. It was the largest employer in this area for many years, and as such affected the life of a lot of people in the area. The area wasn't as heavily industrialized as it is now with various other plants. They didn't, I don't know where any of the departments had separate clubs or not. I don't recall any like that. But everybody, you'd know everybody in your department, plus other people, you know, in the plant. But, and this plant was unique, one that drew its people primarily from surrounding counties of Front Royal, not much towards Washington, but north and south of here and west of here. And they were inclined to be more rugged individualists than people at some of the other operations, particularly up in Marcus Oak, where you had a high immigrant flow. People there were much stronger, I shouldn't say stronger will, but much more inclined to follow union leadership and this type of a thing. And the Front Royal plant never had a strike. It's the only plant that we had that never walked out. Chuck Ledman, he didn't believe in striking, and he was a major factor in that. Some would say the primary factor, but it also reflected the area a lot. You didn't have others around you striking either, in this area.
Do you think the people just had different personalities here? You just said they were rugged individuals?
Well, they're just rugged individualists. The union wasn't going to make them do but so much, and the company wasn't going to make them do but so much. I don't mean they were 100% company people. They were, rugged individualists, I mean people that hard to push around and make do things they didn't want to do. And they were loyal, down-to-earth people. Many people, would, whether you had any rules or not, they had a job, they were going to do it to the best of their ability. And where you paid them much or less or more, they were still going to do the job. That type of attitude, which is not near as prevalent as it used to be, at least in my opinion. But bear in mind, I'm of the old school at my age. things were a lot different. And the Front Royal was family to a mighty lot of people for a long time. Towards the end, they started cutting back and things changed a lot. But for many years, it was the place to work in the area. And that was reflected in the management. Most of the, not all, but most of the top management at the Front Royal plant were people that came in from somewhere else. But a few were hired here right out of college and spent their whole life here and worked up into the upper management level of the plant. Some of the ones from Front Royal moved on up into the Colbert headquarters, which at that time was in Philadelphia. But a lot of them stayed here for years. One plant manager, McVeigh, he was plant manager here for about 20 years. And then things changed, and we didn't have a plant manager in any plant that had been there over 3 or 4 years. But they had previously had plant managers that stayed a long time too. But the whole management tone in the country began to shift. A lot more movement, changing from one place to the other.
Were there a lot of technical innovations during your time at this plant here?
Oh, we were always having problems with something. And of course, rayon was, even though it had been around for a long time, it was improving all the time, going into more special uses. And whatever you had this year wasn't good enough for next year, and you had to come up with it better. We had what many considered the best research department on rayon in the world for many years. It was not located here. It was in primarily in Marcus, Pennsylvania. But we had a lot of things that were border on research going on at all the plants. I remember on tire yarn that wherever you were in strength, and a year later you had to figure out a way to make it about a pound strong before it would break. Same size thread. That was on the rayon itself. If it was going in the carpets, well, you had to come up with a way of making it where it wouldn't had more spring to it, wouldn't crush as easy and that type of a thing. On this plant, the rayon that went into fabrics and clothing, it was more or less displacing cotton. And at one time there was, I don't think there was ever as much rayon used as cotton, but while I worked for the company, rayon surpassed wool in number of pounds. It seemed like to me it was back in the late 40s, 50s. And so things, they were and still are in most industries, a state of flux. Things always improving, and of course there was more competition then than there is now in rayon. Not many rayon plants left in the world, but at that time they were competing against each other to see who could capture. The idea was to capture more of the market and build plant enough, keep adding capacity. And for many years, Front Royal, in terms of the number of pounds of rayon made in a year, was the largest rayon plant in the world for quite a few years. And that accounted to some extent for it lasting as long as it did. But most of the plants ran close to 50 years, which is a long time. And what would happen would be that nobody wanted to invest money to make it into a new plant. The ones that's still running in this country are the newest. They're quite old, but they still were the newest in the country. And we had the know-how, but they would make minor improvements, but not start from scratch, rebuild.
Did that become a problem as the plant began to become really aged?
Well, it took you more people to do the same thing. Took more people to run the plant, and of course as labor costs went up, more labor per pound was involved.
Why did it take more people? You mean more people than at an
Well,
old plant, or more people here?
Well, you could have built a new plant. Let's say if you go back in the 50s, back even in that time, particularly in the 60s, you could build a plant to make the same number of pounds. Say we were making Front Royal, and maybe used a third as many people. We had the technology to do it, but the companies, the ownership of the company didn't seem fit to spend the money that way. They put it into other things, which in their opinion would generate more profits down the line. And some of the last plants have been kind of in third world countries where the government ran them as kind of an economic thing. They needed jobs for the people. That's particularly true when you get into the third world countries, where labor was about the cheapest thing they had. The shortest thing they had was the purchasing equipment and so forth. And some of our people left and went with companies like that.
What was it like the last few years at the plant?
Well, the last few years, I retired from this one in '82, But what was happening, you could see it going down. We weren't spending the money to keep the equipment in top-notch shape. We knew how to do it. Of course, it costs money, and you couldn't cut back much on the manufacturing labor. You're going to run the machines, you just about had to have close to the same number of people that you used always, but you couldn't cut back on the maintenance and on replacing watts and things like that. So it gradually was going down, and finally it closed down. You might say the last straw was basically a government action, but at least in my opinion, it would have gone down anyway. It's just a question of time. It may have ran a year or so longer, not many years.
Was that decision to allow it to run down, you think that was driven by the marketplace, just pressure from competition?
Well, it's driven by investors, basically. Nobody's going to buy stock in a company that they figure the stock's going to be worth less. Of course, right now, the stock market's gone way down, but the people that bought, when they bought it, they didn't expect it to go down. And that's, you can, and synthetics got a lot more prevalent, particularly nylon and then polyester. You can make the same number of pounds of nylon, same number of pounds of polyester with just a fraction of the people that you can round. And also the initial cost would be, of the plant would be a lot lower. So you also would have less pollution problems and that type of a thing. So it's just the overall economy added up where round no longer a competitive fiber. In other words, it costs too much pound to make it. And that not only affected us, it affected everybody in the business. They all, companies like DuPont had a real good rayon products, probably at least equal to anything else manufactured in the world. And yet they closed down all of their rayon operations. I think the last plant went down, seemed like to me it was around 60 or something like that. Quite a ways back. We shifted into other things. When FMC bought us, well, we were quite a generator of cash, and they used that to plow into other activities. As I say, ones like DuPont went out of it. And so ours has been kind of a going down operation a long time.
Did that affect, we talked a little bit earlier about the life of the plant and how people depend on that. As the plant started to go down, did that affect the life of the people who worked there?
I don't think it affected the ones that stayed on. See, you have a fair amount of attrition. If you go down, if you don't just pull the plug all at once, you can go down quite a lot without having to fire. I mean, without having to furlough anybody. It's, people are retiring, moving out of the area. Some of them, of course, pass on. So you have a fair amount of turnover. And I think the ones that left, they were still working about by the same pace that they had been working. And I don't think it really affected them a whole lot. Many of them wouldn't agree with what I've said about gradually going down. They would probably take a different approach. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. I've just given you one person's opinion.
How did you feel when you learned about the closure?
Of this plant? Well, I felt it was going down anyway. I didn't like the way it was shut down. It was, we had representing the state was Mary Sue Terry, and representing Avtex was John Gregg. Both were very strong-willed people. Both wasn't going to let somebody else tell them what to do. And the net effect of it all was that it resulted in costing the taxpayers an enormous amount of money, which was unnecessary. We had people knew how to shut the plant down, drain all the lines and that type of thing, and they just pulled the plug and walked away from it, and that added to the cleanup cost enormously. And I haven't seen anybody that has spent the time to try to calculate how many millions that translated over into, but a lot of them. And we're still paying the price today, even on some of it. It had been shut down. The know-how was here, the people were here that knew how to do it and whatnot. But, you know, just pulled the plugs and walked out. So that part of it I didn't like. I figured it was going down anyway. That was my analysis.
You had done those kind of proper closures in other places. Well, do you know why it wasn't done here?
Well, they reached the impasse, and the orders just came down, shut it down. Basically came down from the state, shut it down, which he did. Neither one of them, even though John Gregg was running the plant, neither one of them really had any invested money in the company at that point in time. And I don't think they had but 500 or 600 people here when they closed it down, so it wasn't a real major impact in terms of personnel. And different people affected differently. A lot of people that were working here, particularly if it'd be up in their 50s or something like that, they were a little bit too young to retire and too old to compete effectively in the job market. A lot of ones that were more competitive, particularly worked in engineering on maintenance and things. A lot of those, the more aggressive ones, got out, found jobs back before it got down to the 500 or 600 range in people. But people that worked on, like in the various manufacturing departments, there wasn't any other rayon plants adding people, so, and most of them didn't want to leave the area. Many of them got hurt financially, and some were quite bitter about it. And, you know, I can't really blame them, because I probably felt the same way if I got caught in the same circumstances. But that's the way life is, and you hate to be caught in the thing. And everybody looks at things different. I remember one time I was up in Lewistown, this is digressing a little bit, and anyway the decision had come down to not start the plant back up. We were working around the clock to get it back running from a flood due to hazel, and one of my girls was in a 4-H horse show and was sitting out there in the stands. Several women was sitting in back of me. They didn't know who I was. Didn't know who they were either. But anyway, they had been working out in the plant, and then, of course, they were out of a job. Well, somebody's bound to buy it. It's been here for 50 years, and employed all these people that had to be making money. Somebody's bound to buy it. Well, nobody bought it. To my knowledge, there's never been a rayon plant shut down in the country, in this country, where somebody has bought it and started it back up as a rayon plant. In other words, if the first people can't make it go as a rayon plant, it's not likely that anyone else can either, what that amounts to. But, and you had a lot of that feeling here. And if you find different management that it would keep going, they would find ways to do it. And some of them would even identify with some members of previous management, you know, found people like them that it would keep going. So there was some bitterness in the area. There perhaps still is some bitterness on some people. And not all the local management would agree with my analysis. So you have to listen to what they say and draw your own conclusions.
What do you think of the redevelopment project?
You mean out here?
Uh-huh.
Well, I think it's good they're trying to do something with the plant. Hopefully make the area an asset to the locality. I feel like that an enormous number of money, an enormous amount of money, up into the millions, has been wasted. People have made big to do about very minor things, in my opinion.
Such as? Give me an example.
Well, I remember one time they were loading a car of CS2, which they were going to ship back to the manufacturer, and had about 30 people dressed up in protective clothing, all standing around watching. 2 people dressed up there, and then in my hospital had special plans for evacuation. Goodness knows they had all the emergency personnel surrounding area alerted. In my humble estimation, the gasoline truck going in front of the hospital posed a much greater damage, potential damage, than that could have possibly imposed on the hospital. That there wasn't any hazard there in the first place. The tank had leaked out on the ground or caught fire or anything that could have possibly happened to it wouldn't have been that. And that's just one example. You could multiply that many fold over on many things that have happened. And that I would say that my opinion is probably shared, to some extent formed by most of the people that had the top technical knowledge of the plant. But you always have other people inputting, and a lot of them get caught up in various fears and suspicions and that type of a thing. And sometimes to put brakes on it's hard to do. So I would like to see it be an asset to the area and the community. Although I'm not a native around here, I've lived here more years than I have any other one place, and still live here and don't expect to move as far as that goes.
Take a little break. You need a little break? Okay.
I'm all right. So that's a controversial subject. See, I don't know of any controversy on scrapping the plant and tearing it down, cleaning it up, and so forth. I don't know of any controversy on that. It's on the depths that have been gone to and are being gone to. Of course, on some things like asbestos, a lot more emphasis is placed on that than it would have been even 10 years ago, let alone 25 years ago. But a lot of the other chemicals are not near as life-threatening as what some people would have you believe. That's even true of PCBs. There's a lot of people that are intellectually dishonest that are in some of these organizations pushing for things, and then a lot of other people that are well-intentioned, well-meaning, but they believe them, and that causes some of the excess. But I don't know in the final analysis if you use a few more people to do something than what's absolutely necessary, that the end product's what you're really after. And I think the overall plan's good. I think it will be a benefit to the area and whatnot.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What are some of the specifics when the plug was pulled? I know from Jim Colbert that that it solidified what was in some of the processing. What are some of the specifics that ended up costing money because the plug was pulled?
Well, normally if you shut a plant down right, if you have the option of shutting it down, which they had here. Contrast that with one like Lewistown, which was flooded out, and it went down, due to high water level. Well, then everything, all the lines were full. So what you would do is drain all the lines, you drain all the tanks, you ship back raw materials to your suppliers, and it's not something you could do in 24 hours, but you would do it gradually, and it would leave a lot less to be handled and cleaned up, particularly on corrosive chemicals and whatnot. If it's a water line, it wouldn't make much difference. You can drain it anytime. But it makes a lot of difference if it's a viscose line, because it'll change from liquid viscose to solid viscose, and you can't drain it. It does that fairly fast. On things like CS2, even on those, you can go back, but it's much better because we had it in all stages. Some of the vessels what you put in charging the CS2 into had already been charged, and others hadn't, and just makes a lot harder operation, cost a lot more money to do, and might even argue it can't be done as well. See on take like all the lines in the plant, I shouldn't say all of them, most of them were metal, which can be sold if you but you can't sell a pipe that's full of viscose. It's got too many other hazards associated with it, and nobody would buy it. The current market, if you cleaned it out, flushed it out with water and so forth, could be sold. Always a sale for scrap metal. Plastic lines don't have much sale, but there wasn't a whole lot of plastic in the plant. There were a lot of stainless steel, a lot of lead, a lot of just plain steel, and all that, some brass. All that can be soaked.
Did you ever have nightmares or worries knowing that sulfuric vat was sitting over here, just sitting here? Did you ever worry about the chemicals that were just sitting here after it closed? Did you ever wonder if they were...
No, I'd worked around sulfuric acid all my life. Just have to drain them out and wash out the tanks, and cut them up with scrap and salt.
I know Fred Foster said the sulfuric acid tank. Put it on. Let me turn it on.
Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2.
You talked about John Gregg and Mary Sue Terry both being sort of determined in their approach to what happened with the closing. Do you think that the fact that the plug was just pulled and walked away with the pipes full of material, was that kind of a vindictive thing, or just it happened so fast that no one made the right decisions?
Well, I don't think it happened so fast that no one made the right decisions. I think it was a clash of personalities, which unfortunately neither was gambling with their money, and it would have probably been different if they had have been, and that John Gregg was an extremely difficult person to get along with in his later years, and he's since died of brain cancer. How much that affected him is anybody's guess. I've known him when he first came to work with the company. I was in front row. He came by. I remember meeting him on his first trip up there. He was a very dynamic individual, tremendously full of energy and whatnot. But at the end, even his wife couldn't control him, and it's hard to say how much he was affected by what finally killed him. I'm sure he was affected a lot, but how much, I don't know. But he made a lot of irrational decisions. But he didn't make the decision on this. The orders was to shut it down. She was in position to issue the orders from the state. She told him to shut it down. He shut it down.
You said Greg was making irrational decisions. Could you give me an example?
Oh, he got to the point where he had a hard time telling the good people from the bad ones in certain situations. Whereas in his prime, he had a lot of skill in that area. He made a lot of other irrational decisions too. Had to do with raw materials and who was to blame for different things, and all kinds of things like that. He was always nice to me. I never personally had any trouble with him. But there again, and I wasn't one of his inner circle people by any means. He did have an inner circle, primarily people that he'd gone to school with or had worked with in his life of the company. He was in sales all of his life, really, but with the company. And he came with the company shortly out of college, NC State.
I'm not sure if I understand who was responsible for the decision not to do the proper shutdown.
It wasn't a decision not to make a proper shutdown. It was a decision to shut the plant down. I don't think anybody wrote any specifications on how to shut it down. They probably didn't have that ability. They just made the decision to shut it down, and they just shut it down. I say pull the plug. That might be the wrong way, but they just turned everything off. Walked in. Walked out. No, which has cost a lot of money. But I don't have a figure. I haven't. But right now, I wouldn't have the knowledge to do it. Access the facts.
It sounds like, from what you're telling us, that to you, that this plant was really just sort of living a typical life of a plant of this type, and that its demise was typical, coming anyway because it was of that age where rayon plants become so aged that they're ending their useful life.
Well, I think that's true, but no longer competitive in the world of fibers. You know, fiber can be real good, but that has to have a price tag on it. And the other things that you can substitute for it sell cheaper. Then they'll gradually take over. You know, like one time you couldn't hardly buy a men's suit, like a jacket like I've got on, that didn't have a rayon lining in it. Just rayon just about had the entire market, and then that's gone to zero now. You can't buy one with it now. So it makes a lot of difference on the price of the fiber. What got rayon in to start with was that it could compete with cotton price-wise in many applications. No longer can.
Are you saying that rayon became a more costly because it was more labor intensive than some of the synthetics like nylon?
Yeah. Well, it takes more labor and takes more energy to make it. Like for many years, this plant burned about 1,000 tons of coal a day in, day out. That's a lot of energy to expend on the plant. It takes more energy to make rayon. It also has a lot more pollution problems. All rayon plants are located on a stream, so you have pollution problems of a river or a stream of some type.
Why are they all located on a stream?
Because it takes a lot of water in the process to make it, and to the best of my knowledge, every rayon plant in the world is located on a source of water. And then the water they put out, a lot of which they just circulate around, but the water they put back out, the purity standards on it keep going up. But you know, what's good enough this year or 10 years from now won't be good enough.
What is in the water that comes out that causes the pollution problems?
Well, it has some sodium sulfate in it, and it has, which in itself is not particularly harmful, but is used to, on a lot of these saying when studies that say how much you're dumping into the river pollution, they add it up. They add that in where, without putting an explanation on it, at least in my mind, being dishonest intellectually, they know that, people that are putting it out. But you also put zinc in the river, and it affects the life in the river. And zinc is a compound that a higher life, such as people, cattle or anything like that. Can take a fair amount of zinc, but some municipal water supplies used to have a fair amount of zinc in them out west. But the lower forms of life, like insects that live in the river, certain worms and certain types of the lower forms can't take as much. And what that does is kills off the food supply chain for the higher animal forms in the river. So there's zinc going into the river. That for many years was pretty well under control. Then there's some CS2 gets in, there's some H2S, that's a gas, but a little bit of that in there. Those are the main ones. And some of the things that they're talking now about arsenic, well, that's there was no arsenic, to my knowledge, ever used in the plant. But when you it occurs naturally when you burn coal and wind up with ashes. Or in the case of this plant, you wind up with fly ash. It's most of the arsenic winds up in the ash, and then if water leaks over the fly ash, which is some of that stored on the site here, it'll leach out. Among other things, it has arsenic in it. Not very much, but it has some. So this process is just a high-cost process from the standpoint of labor and the standpoint of energy and the standpoint of pollution, both air and stream. Also, we're putting out CS2 into the atmosphere and H2S into the atmosphere, and when you burn coal, one of the more recent things is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We put out a lot of that too. Where you burn coal, oil, or gas, and never did burn gas in. But at one time, we had the capacity at this plant to shift back and forth within quite a range on between oil and coal, and that was just strictly based on the economics. Whichever one you could burn the cheapest, with the same amount of energy you'd burn.
Yeah.
It didn't make any better or any worse, one versus the other. But it does affect what goes out into the air.
How does the production of synthetics compare? What's their advantage in the cost, pollution?
Well, they don't take near as many. I mean, the labor is way down to make the same amount of the principal synthetics. I'm talking primarily polyester, nylon, acrylics. They don't have near the air pollution problems, practically no stream pollution problems associated with them. And so you can make it cheaper. And the capital cost of building the plant, say if you build a plant to make 100 million pounds of rayon a year, the capital cost of the plant probably be several fold what it would be of the equivalent capacity nylon or one of the other synthetics.
One thing I should ask you, Jim, for the people who will be seeing this tape, could you give us kind of a schoolboy's version of how do you make rayon, what that process is?
Oh, at my age and what I've forgotten and whatnot, I'd probably be better off to stay out of it. But in a real real short answer, rayon is regenerated cellulose, and say if you have a real pure rayon, it's 100% cellulose. Same as if you have a pure cotton, it's 100% cellulose, close to it. So it's chemically, rayon is very similar to cotton. The strength and other characteristics depend a lot on how you've got the the molecules aligned. You can align them in such a manner that it makes it stronger. You can make rayon that's strength-wise stronger than cotton. You can make it where it's more absorbent than cotton. You can do a whole lot of things to tailor make it for certain end uses, but it's basically chemically it comes back around that it and cotton are the same thing. But so we buy wood pulp. The raw materials for rayon, basic raw materials are just a few. You buy wood pulp that's made from trees primarily, but it can be made from other things. And that start out with the cellulose and the wood pulp, and it's wood pulp by rayon grade wood pulp by definition is almost 100% cellulose. But it's like cotton, it won't dissolve in many things. And you treat it first with caustic soda or lye. The chemical word would be sodium hydroxide. You treat it with that, and then you treat it with CS2, which is carbon disulfide, and then it will dissolve in a caustic solution, and that's what's called viscose. And most of the names of the early companies had viscose somewhere or another in the name. And this known as the viscose process of making rayon. Then if you treat the viscose back with acid, prime one that's usually used is sulfuric acid, well then it breaks down, and you wind back up with the cellulose. So you wind it up with what you started with, except it's in a thread form, fiber form, and so it can be used for various end uses.
What does viscose look like?
Viscose is a viscous, thick like a syrup, liquid, usually orange in color. That's due to the sulfur content from the CS2 and whatnot. And you push it through a small hole into a sulfuric acid bath, and then it becomes a thread. Push it through a slot, and it becomes cellophane, which we had a cellophane plant in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That process almost the same as this, except instead of making a thread, they pushed it through a slot into the same type of bath, and you wind up with a sheet instead of a thread. But and rayon that's tailor-made for one end use may or may not be good for another. It all depends on what you're trying to do. A few odd examples. You can make a tint out of rayon that will be stronger than the same weight of tint made out of cotton, for instance. And you can either make it have the same strength, you can either make it lighter weight, so you don't have as many pounds to carry around. At one time, Front Royal was a major supplier of rayon for tires. And during World War II, started out all military vehicles had cotton cord in the tires, and by the end of the war, they all had rayon. Not all of which came from Front Royal, but a lot of it did. And that was a basic reason for the government taking the plant over during World War II, was to crank out the tire yarn for military vehicles. And I wasn't here in those days, but that's well documented in some of the literature that is available here now and will be in the museum and the library. That's about run out.
Yeah.
You've about got everything I know, plus